I will do that recording, and hopefully we can also share on that our center website.
Yeah, that will be good because this is a very relevant theme for long-term discussion actually.
True, sir, true.
Our chairperson Asha Sarangi seems to have met Aasim, Dr. Aasim Akhtar in Karachi a few years back. So she had very fond memories. So she wanted to convey her hi to him.
I think Professor Aasim will be joining soon. So and then you can personally convey to him.
Yes, I'll do that.
I think Professor Aasim Sajjad is joining. Good evening, Professor Aasim Sajjad.
Thank you. Thank you for that.
So we have, I think, 1-2 minutes. So Professor Ajay is here. So before we start, you can have a little chat or kind of introduction.
Yeah. Hello, Aasim.
How are you, Ajay?
Yeah, I'm fine, Aasim. You are quite popular in India. My chairperson, many of them know you already.
I'm not sure that's such a good thing for me in Pakistan to be popular in India.
The same in India, not very different. We are sailing the same boat.
Yeah.
Asha Sarangi is now heading our center, seems to met you in Karachi. I don't know if you remember.
I do, vaguely, yes. I have some recollection, yes.
Yeah, so she said she wanted to convey her hello to you.
So we start in 2 minutes.
Sure.
We have I was saying to Professor Ajay that we have more than 100 people have registered.
Okay.
But we can only accommodate 100 people. So
is that Zoom's constraints or your own?
It's a Zoom. It's a Zoom because even the paid one, that is a kind of
sure.
101.
So, Rajiv, you have planned this at an opportune time. China, India, and Pakistan in today's days, I think you have planted all three of us are in trouble.
I think whole world is going through kind of difficult phase.
The political pandemic.
We have a political pandemic and also another pandemic. So
give me 1 second.
I think the whole world is passing through the same kind of.
I know.
Yeah, you have in protest in Thailand, then you have this Nigeria. So everything is, I think, imagine that everything is pre-COVID normal thing. So even that we can say that the humans are so corrupt that even the COVID cannot stop us to stop fighting.
Yeah, that's true. That generally people thought this will make human beings more contemplative, COVID.
I don't think so, because we have our own interest and then selfness, what the Plato has said. I think now we have this, we can start now. So you can have a talk and then we can start. Can we start?
Sure.
Okay, thank you. Good evening, everyone. Before I formally start, let me have this housekeeping announcement that please mute your mic, otherwise it would keep disturbing us. Anyone, please? It's echoing. I don't know, some problem.
I suspect you could probably mute their mics for them if they haven't done it themselves.
I think yeah, someone is there. Let me do that. Because there are so many, so I have to go through this.
Yeah.
That's a problem with the Zoom. Okay, anyway, good evening, everyone. Once again, I'm Rajiv, faculty at Shanghai University. Today we are meeting to discuss kind of like left politics in South Asia. We have experts from Pakistan and India to discuss left politics in South Asia. As we know that, I don't know why that my mic is echoing. As we know that the world is experiencing a rise of populism, at the same time also the neoliberal forces is also at rise. Thereby, like you can link, because of this phenomenon, we have this somewhat that this socialism or idea of socialism or left politics is declining. But there are other forces, other factors responsible for this decline in this left politics, left ideology in South Asia. But if we come to the South Asia, then we can see that the weakening of this left in South Asia, not only in terms of electoral terms, but also organizational structure. Except Nepal, that we have there's a left government in Nepal. Now, if being an Indian, but I'm working in China, so if I have to like talk about this left, then let me talk about a little bit kind of India. And then if you talk about the politics, the left politics, then we have to like think that the history of the left is not different than what the history of general history of that country is, what the Gramsci had. But the problem is that we tend to ignore that the general history of a country and try to separate the identity or even the history of the left, and that becomes problematic. Like when we talk about this left politics in India, and then we have to also see from the sidelines or maybe in a very comparison mode that what the general history of India is saying. Now, what in China, the Chou Enlai says that left politics or the communism is webs of people from in the sea. The leadership is the comb that forms in that sea. But if you see this scenario in India, what happened is the sea of these webs, the webs is mostly tribal people, SC people, that the OBC, but the leadership is coming from outside. So you can say that it's like in the river, that in the sea, that the leadership is coming from outside, is like flower petals or the leaves from outside. Now, I think maybe the Indian left has taken Lenin ideas that the leadership is outside of this workforce. Now, the problem is there. Once that the Adivasis, that the tribal people and OBC did not connect with this left politics because they have been used as a flag bearer rather than promoting them as a leader. So it's a very grim scenario that you can see that even though there are like since 1925, there are no FC or tribal leadership or general secretary either in CPI or CPM, except in CPI they have now D. Raja. So these, when the forces, the democratic forces change, the South Asia is largely a democratic country. So these, the left politics or communist parties have to situate in this democratic structure. So they have to win the power rather than the power is given them as a de facto. So they have to win. Now, where there are elections, so they have to win this election. Now, the problem is when the whole, there is an electoral reform, you can say, or like there is a churning, democratic churn in India. So this, and then a movement or tribal movement or mandal that we know in India, the mandal movement, then, and also Ambedkarite movement in India. So they detached from the left politics in India. So, and they also want to have their leadership. That's a problem in the left politics that I see in India. That is my understanding of India. That is, there is a kind of alienation, there is a detachment between the masses and the leadership. So the party has not become a vanguard of the masses. So there is a kind of a kind of gap between the masses and the leadership. So you can say that if in India it's a caste that has kind of like become hurdles. So in Pakistan or like in Bangladesh, there is a kind of religious religion that has kind of somewhat that has stopped this ideology to become a main force in this country. So I would not go into detail because we have a scholar here to discuss what is left in the left in South Asia. So let me introduce Professor Aasim Sajjad Akhtar. Professor Akhtar is educated in political sociology at SWAS in London and also have degree in economics at Yale University. He is currently professor at Quaid-e-Azam University in Islamabad. He writes frequently in Dawn, that is one of the main newspaper in Pakistan. And I read regularly this Dawn to know about what's happening in Pakistan. So I had to learn much from this interaction. And we have Professor Ajay Gudavarthy from Jawaharlal Nehru University. He's professor at Center for Political Studies in JNU. He has written many books on this left movement and idea of this kind of like civil society also. His recent book is India After Modi, Populism and the Right, that is also being published in Chinese, maybe in 2021. He has also written Maoism, Democracy and Globalization, Cross-Cultural Indian Politics. And one thing that is common between both of our speakers is they both write in economic EPW that is published in India. So if anyone interested to know more about their writing, they can follow EPW. Another thing that is common is that both are a visiting fellow at SWAS. So I don't need to, I think, go into more details in reading Professor Aasim Sajjad CV. One had to just open Google and then type, it will come. Now, I invite Professor Aasim Sajjad to talk on his topic. Professor Sajjad, we have, like you can talk around 30 to 45 minutes. And then we have Professor Ajay Gudavarthy. We will talk around 25 to 30 minutes. And then we will open for Q&A session. And before you take the floor, let me have this housekeeping announcement. Please mute your mic. And if any one of you have questions, please put them in chat box. we will read it for you so that there is no disturbance. Thank you and welcome Professor Aasim Sajjad.
Thank you. Kind of you. And thank you for organizing this session, and for everyone else, including Ajay for joining and agreeing to be part of the discussion. It's as we were talking before we formally began. It's not it's unusual, let's say, for academics, scholars based in these three countries of India, Pakistan, and China to actually be involved in a shared discussion. So I'm grateful for the opportunity that you've provided. I guess I'll just start very briefly with following from what was said in the introduction about the history of the left, or trying to think through left politics in any of these countries is which requires thinking about the history of these countries and states, respective states, and social formations in their entirety. And one is to understand history, the present, potentially the future, which I guess is why we talk about these things, because we're not disinterested observers. We also have some stakes in the future. Requires us to vest our analysis in society at large. And so certainly, I think the history of the left in Pakistan looks, different from the history of the left in India, or Nepal, or Sri Lanka. And so while the subject is broadly South Asia as a whole, I think what I am sort of best suited to doing is speaking mostly about Pakistan, with some perhaps comparative insights thrown in when and where I think I'm equipped to do so. So, in just sort of giving you a sense of why this title itself, why I suggested this. The reference is, for those of you who are familiar, is to Gramsci, and to amongst his many different conceptual sort of the repertoire that he gave us. One was related to, as many of you know, he talked often in military metaphors. And so one of these metaphors was about within his larger theory of politics, the questions of strategy broadly. And so this distinction between a war of position and a war of maneuver refers largely to how we think about both the goal of political struggle and the way political struggle is waged. And if on the one hand, and this applies not just to the left, this applies to the right, this applies to everyone, this applies to our commonplace, common sense understanding of politics. If on the one hand it is about state power or acquiring state power, then on the other hand it is about something that may include the acquisition of state power, but is about something much deeper than that. That's social transformation. So this was one of the very many conceptual, nominally binaries that he offered us to think about the relationship between the acquisition of state power, political power as such, and perhaps for Gramsci, the more significant or more the deeper sort of objective of transforming society towards ostensibly what the Marxist tradition would be a classless society, a communist society, what have you. And so the war of position versus war of maneuver metaphor that I've thrown in there, I think, speaks to me to this question of both is the left in the contemporary period in a position to wage a war of maneuver, to acquire state power, to aspire to the acquisition of state power, and therefore to develop strategies forthwith, and not mutually exclusively If it is, okay, what does that look like? And if it isn't, in either case, the other sort of related objective of social transformation, or transforming social relations more broadly, addressing the rule of capital, and as Rajiv just pointed out, very many other social contradictions in India could be cast in Pakistan. It could look not only, but it could look like religious majoritarianism, gender more broadly across all of these social formations. What is a war of position in terms of what Gramsci would call in the trenches of civil society, the longer, harder perhaps task of transforming our consciousness of the way we see the world, and looking at the acquisition of state power as a part of that process. So I threw that in there, I think, just to get us to think more broadly about this dialectic. And I think this is a dialectic that informs the revolutionary left's struggle anywhere through time and space. Unfortunately, in many cases, including the contemporary, it's like, you look around you, I don't know, I can't imagine it's the same in China. It may be the same in India, but in Pakistan, every third person has a sticker of Che Guevara on the back of their vehicle. And he's sort of like this cool figure with a cool sort of beret on his head. But there's no awareness or consciousness of who this figure was and what his politics was. And so, in a sense, I think, broadly speaking, at least in Pakistan, there's two, historically and moving into the contemporary period, there's two sort of broad caricatures of what it means to be the revolutionary left. One is, of course, the highly propagandized view, which was propagated primarily through the 1980s, but also before then, which is that to be communist or on the left in Pakistan is to be anti-state. In a worst-case scenario, therefore, to be anti-religion. But even on the left of the spectrum, somewhat superficial, well, let's storm the gates, in sort of Leninist fashion, and take state power and sort of magically transform society by, let's say, nationalizing the means of production. Here's some broad, very sort of general nodes of understanding of what a left project looked like. And for me, at least in my work and also in my engagement with the left, I think the need to deepen that understanding to something of the form that Gramsci talked about. Of course, all revolutionary figures in history have talked about this. It's just whether our understanding of them is beyond the superficial. That revolution simply involves storming the gates. Storming the gates is not to suggest it's not important, but just to point out that it's one part of a very complex whole. And in Pakistan, generally speaking, even on the left, there often tends to be a lot of prosaic debates without a lot of engagement with, for instance, some of the deep, complex issues that Rajiv mentioned in terms of perhaps the relationship between leaders and led, whether it be caste composition of leaderships, or more broadly, this question of, and I think the 20th century left experiments around the world bore this out, does acquiring state power, sort of giving a fillip to the forces of production, to use some classic Marxist terminology, catching up to the capitalist West, does that automatically translate into new forms of consciousness, or what Che famously wrote about the socialist man? Presumably, he was also referring to a socialist woman as well. But does that relationship is not seamless? And if I might add, again, my limited knowledge of Chinese or the Chinese Revolution confirms this, that these relationships are not linear or teleological. China today is a much more economically developed society than it was 50 years ago. But I guess some would make the argument that China under Mao was more concerned with forms of socialist culture and consciousness. Maybe this is essentially something that one could argue. So this is just a broad sort of framing about, I think, these questions are worth putting out. The reason I say this is because what I would suggest to you right now, getting into a long detour about history, and my understanding of how things have changed, it's the midst of the youth bulge. And much of this population across what is called the digital divide is being integrated to use a sort of that through the digital space, young people in solidarity with or inspired by experiences in other parts of the world. And generally, the ability to transcend a sort of a statist public sphere, a delineated, mediated public sphere where ideas just as they do online. Now, I'm interested in something I'm also working on. That's the objective truth. That's the objective situation. In practice, the right has actually benefited from this more, whether it's this slew of perhaps what the fate of the most infamous one of them all is next week in the American presidential election. What that suggests is that so to speak, the free flow of ideas or the opening up of a digital space, which is a new phenomenon. I felt like this was an important sort of thing to add to the debate early, because for me, this feels like in thinking about what is the left now or what it may be moving forward, I think this is a huge factor. There's of course many things, but this is one of the things that I think is worth focusing on. What that suggests is that just the sheer existence of an objective space called the digital space or the online space where ideas nominally flow freely does not lead to, does not necessarily produce a revolutionary subject imbued with some kind of clear, coherent, Gramscian good sense, which is a bit of some fragments of existing common sense, but also critical consciousness that one would get, let's say, from the online circulation of ideas to forge a subject. Part of that, mind you, is because I think on the left, broadly what I call the left, and this is something that I think also speaks to the past and the present, the left was embodied by a particular kind of revolutionary subject, whether it be the classical industrial proletariat, whether it be sort of the Maoist variant, whether it be in South Asia, the anti-colonial vanguard, sort of the one that fell prey to sort of a Fanonian tragedy of becoming the Kala Saab to replace the Gora Saab. But either way, that not uncontested, but somewhat hegemonic subject has given way to many. It's given weight, as you say, Rajiv. It's given weight to at least the contestation that who represents the left, who speaks for the left, who speaks for tribals, who speaks for the heartland, who speaks for people, confessional groups that are not part of the majoritarian group, who speaks for women and transgenders. And so much of what I think of the contemporary left, especially in the online space, is constantly grappling within itself about this particular kind of question, which of course, I'm not sure if it's ironic, but actually what that means is that the right doesn't really have that kind of grappling. Because the right forges its subject online through a sort of demonization of the other. It's sort of it's a politics of hate. Whereas the universal subjectivity that the left has historically sort of relied on is, I think, conspicuous by its absence. And that I think is a big question that animates my interest in of course, contemporary politics. The right is unapologetic. It is sexist. It is racist. It is, it ascribes to a xenophobic nationalism. It's them versus us. And us doesn't even really have to be specified. It's more the them that is not us. Whereas for us on the left, there's so many us's, so to speak, that is actually the question. A subject that is characterized by forms of difference. Yes, sure, but it still needs a uniform political project. And that, in Pakistan, at least for me, seems to be absent. A related question, which I started off with, again, which relates, and I hope this doesn't sound like a ramble. To me, it feels like these things relate to one another, is, of course, the project, the vision. Now, the left of the 20th century had a clear, sort of like, always had a clear, however idealized vision of the future. This is what we seek to make. This is the alternative. This is what our society looks like, the society that will replace capitalist society, the global sort of community that will transcend imperialism. And with the sort of in some ways, especially the green question, the question of ecology, which I know China is now grappling with quite extensively with its conceptualization of an ecological civilization. This is another sort of, is a quandary. What is the vision? What is, when one does, so to speak, launch a war maneuver and take power, what is it that we are creating? Because, of course, insofar as the project was unambiguous in the 20th century, that you accelerate the forces of production, and that actually leads you from the realm of what Marx called the realm of necessity to the realm of freedom, where the material constraint has been transcended. I think technology potentially offers that in any case, but the real question is, does our world, which is a capitalist world, the logic of capitalism is dominant, but what is, do we have the developmental project, our developmental project, the question of nature and a harmonious relationship of humanity and nature, because I think in many senses what's happened in the imperialist West, and potentially also some of China's relationships with countries like Pakistan, is there is sort of a displacement of the ecological question to countries like us who are still in some ways debtors and still dealing with some of the longer term legacies of dependency. So that is a related question. because that also speaks to what is the universal subject and what is the project, what is the imaginary, what is the horizon. And so I think that then brings me back to this question of war of position. In a sense, the war of position is by default the strategy of the contemporary left, partly because state power is an aspiration that is probably not viable. The only part of South Asia where we see communists are in power are Nepal, right? And which of course is a very important example and a case to try and think through, both in terms of how they reconciled their path of armed struggle with sort of coming into the mainstream via elections, and then the quite tortured process of internal struggle and finally writing something close to a consensus constitution. But even there, even where in Nepal, from my little reading of it, I'm not sure that these questions of the subject and the internal contradictions within the people and the imaginary of where the project leads has been resolved. Nevertheless, they're still one step ahead of Pakistan, where there is no viable project for state power on the left. And in India, I think a lot of it has been written about the mainstream communist parties and their downward trajectory since, what was it, when the Speaker of the Lok Sabha was 2004, I think, and since then it's been since Nandigram in 2007, it's a downward trajectory. And with the exception of Kerala, which of course I think has got a lot of good and needed press with regards to its response to the pandemic. But I think that the fact that mainstream, sort of parliamentary communism is also in sort of an existential crisis speaks to all questions, speaks to the question of who is the subject, speaks to the question of what is the developmental imaginary, and I don't think that it's been resolved. Now, it would be great if I said, well, I know what the resolution is, this is what it looks like. And partly what I'm posing is that I don't, and I'm not sure any of us do. And in a sense, then, the war of position is what we are left with, both as a ways of through struggle sorting this out. But I will say something towards the end in terms of sorting this out, which takes me back to where I started. I think that and this is something that I spent the last year writing a book about, in the process of finishing it up. I think that we, at least sort of what I would call the post-colonial world, right? Like the youth bulge world, whether it be South Asia or Africa as well. I think I haven't come across a lot of stuff that grapples with the digital and thinking about the politics in the digital space. I think that what I've observed is young people, on the one hand, I'm grateful as young people being politicized coming in and developing critical consciousness, but I also see a lot of unproductive, let's say, debate and internal wrangling, while the right is running right, so to speak. And I think that means a need to think through this, because, of course, this has never been this way in China, but in much of the world, there's been these phases, right? So it was like the digital is the space of democracy and debate and so on and so forth. Now in the West, of course, the digital is the site of big tech and surveillance capitalism and all sorts of other stuff that's been written about. But I think in terms of our context, where we have demographic change happening, where large numbers of people are coming into this digital life world, for me, that seems to be a big sort of, a big field that we need to think about. in thinking through this questions of politics, of strategy, of subjectivity, of our developmental imaginary. Because what I see, and I'll close with this, what I see is in Pakistan at least, and I imagine it's similar in India from what I've followed, is that the digital is a space for people to articulate a politics of resistance, whether it's resistance to capital, resistance to multinationals, resistance to majoritarianism, which is necessary. It's not sufficient. Sufficient conditions are what I have outlined. I feel what I've outlined for you. Some ability to articulate who is the subject, or what is this multiplicity of subjects, and generating a left project from this multiplicity, and then the developmental imaginary, horizon, what the future world looks like, right? Which of course was communism always had sort of as its, in some ways, as its primary appeal, right? It was this imagination of a future world, which I think we are struggling with. And I think that on the digital side, when I see young people, they get involved, they are, it generates a lot of activism. It's a space that, on the one hand, is not so easy to regulate, but on the other hand, I'm not sure that without an adequate theorization of it, that from that space will necessarily emerge any answer to these big questions, through which that long war of position can lead eventually to us reaching a stage where we can wage a war. So I'll leave it at that, and hopefully, Ajay can add and subtract and amend to take this discussion forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Akhtar, for very enlightening talk, and that you have moved from like physical space to digital space. That's how left can resist, and that's, I think, it's a very it's a one area that left has to like kind of like discover. And then you also highlighted that it is like new, like non-traditional aspects of the politics, that is environmentalism, that left has to again kind of innovatively engage. I think that's again it's a very crucial point that left can ponder over. Now, I would invite Professor Ajay to talk on this topic.
So thanks, Raji, and thanks, Aasim, for that very rich and you have managed to cover a large area in terms of prospects of left and where it's wanting, and kind of attempted to raise new sets of issues that are, I think, very hands-on in terms of how left needs to rethink its project of radical social transformation and revolution. So let me begin by raising certain kind of a background conceptual question that might be relevant to what you have said, and then some specifics of the specific kinds of issues you have touched upon to sort of just open it up for discussion for us, to help us to really think. And issues seem to be pretty much very similar in Pakistan and India, at least on the front of left. I think we seem to actually share very similar dilemmas, and that's something to actually to feel good about. At least it's not movement, but at least the left dilemmas seem to be very, very kind of similar kind of questions we are grappling with here in India and Pakistan. So in terms of broad conceptual issues, let me raise 3 or 4 broad conceptual issues. That I think one, the nature of democracy in South Asia, in countries like India and Pakistan itself, and I think left needs more clarity, especially the fact that democracy preceded industrialization in both these countries. We did not have a fully developed, matured bourgeois control before democracy actually was initiated in these countries. I think it makes democracy distinct in South Asia. That we can no longer take the traditional classical ideas that Marxism fundamentally grounds in terms of democracy being liberal democracy or a bourgeois democracy. And I see this some kind of a tension for democracy itself being left parties themselves being part of the democratic process. They continue to hold on to their classical critique of democracy as bourgeois democracy. I think there is a kind of inherent tension in the working of, especially the constitutional parliamentary left India and maybe Pakistan too. That therefore, I think there is something here for us to radically rethink that democracy in our South Asian context might hold different kinds of potential. And therefore, we need to rethink this project of our equation with democracy as something that is born now. And that's the reason democracy, holds a kind of a hope that the left is not really able to articulate. We have a more robust class critique of democracy rather than looking at the potential of what democracy and democratic mobilization, voting, participation in electoral politics does to the subaltern social classes. But here, I would add a caveat that the anomaly seems to be that the subaltern social classes are invested in democracy but have less trust in democratic institutions. This also, I think, creates a different kind of a complexity for left politics. That the people trust democracy as a process, but people have left on democratic institutions as well, whether it is the judiciary, whether it is the executive, whether even it is the parliament. It's a very, very strange, anomalous kind of a condition that we have. That and left needs to grapple with this complexity. I think there are innumerable amounts of details that left often seems to miss in its broad brush understanding of left-oriented kind of mobilization, which repeatedly sort of puts blockades. It's like what Gramsci talks about block dialectic, that goes so far and no further. Unless we don't open up these bottlenecks in our own thought process. I think one reason why left is being repeated in spite of its committed activists. I see some of the brightest lot, the most committed young lot in the left, but it seems to hit a bottleneck. I'm only trying to suggest, draw your attention to some of these possible bottlenecks that left might have. The second important anomaly that I find in the South Asian context is the character of capitalism. Even in the post-war in Europe itself, in the highlands of capitalism, it was often referred to as reform capitalism. That there was some kind of social democratic character to capitalism. Even in places like UK, for instance, you have a nationalized health system. All the northern European countries, the Scandinavian countries. And if you look at the Indian case, that invention or inauguration of neoliberal reform in post-1990 also led to a massive expansion of welfare. In fact, I would say that a proper welfare state in India began in 1990. The amount of expansion of welfare policies that happened in India post-1990 with NREG, right to food, right to work, right to education, street vendors bill, communal violence bill, social sector, there has been massive expansion of welfareism. So this again, I think, is an anomaly in terms of understanding. Can left really afford to go in terms of a very traditional understanding of capitalism and markets and that equation between state and capital. I think in Indian context and in the South Asian context broadly, the equation seems to be very, very different. Partly this was captured by Kalyan Sanyal kind of work, rethinking capitalist development, where he talks about reversal of privatization through welfare policy. So I think we need, again, left perhaps needs a very robust understanding of this equation between welfare and capitalism. That when there is so much of social democratic welfareism within capitalist, kind of, I would call it a reform capitalism, I think much of what left promises to do sometimes is already delivered by capitalism itself. Maybe staggered, maybe with growth of inequality. That's again a very introduction of neoliberalism in India pushed 270 odd million people out of abject poverty, brought them kind of a tenuous mobility. yet inequalities grow by many folds. So this creates a kind of a very complex situation for left to offer a kind of a quick, hands-on, direct, head-on critique of neoliberalism of capitalism, which I think does not make much sense to make the lived experience of the subaltern social class, because they experience it through welfare, they experience it through a promise of better inclusion and some kind of a narrative that is being made possible. So our left critique that we often give of capitalism as some kind of a doomsday phenomenon, I think doesn't speak to majority. So how do we then repoliticize welfareism? Would it not be better for us to work internally to the welfare discourse itself, rather than project welfareism as some kind of a hegemonic capitalist discourse, rather than work internally to push more welfareism? Do you think this is going to work better for less, or would it create conditions of more hegemony for justifying capitalism? Could be, I think, a complex question for us to deal with. Third, Aasim, I feel is a question that you did not touch upon. I thought you would, perhaps. I thought is a question of culture. We just simply can't leave out the question of culture and community in the South Asian context. And I think perhaps left has been the weakest. It has been some kind of weak link in the Indian context, at least. That I see that left has a robust critique of tradition, but it does not have a critique of modernity in place. I see modernity as a genus-based phenomenon, that on one hand it does unleash liberation potential to contractual relations, to exchange relations, language of law and right, but it also has a large underside of undermining community relations, primary ties, ethnic relations, even caste relations in that sense. I think left has perhaps been at its weakest in terms of conceptualizing this life world of community and culture. That it simply, I think, is uncomfortable with the question of culture. One, it does not have a critique of modernity. And the other, I think, it seems to simply collapse culture with conservatism. It feels that culture is all about only being conservative. But as I see, drawing from some of the cultural sociologists, that culture, I think, has to be made sense in terms of a meaning-giving exercise. That is meaning to our experiences. It gives categories to make sense of our own life. And that's what even tradition, myth, mythology, all of this religion also, I think, does this kind of a thing. And left somehow has great difficulty in terms of its own understanding of materialism, what Marx called the new materialism, relative autonomy that values, myth, morality, social psychology, what we call subjective output in terms of morality, in terms of emotion. All of this somehow, for very strange reasons, right seems to be more at ease with all these categories than the left. Left shrinks when you talk of emotion. Left becomes bitter when you talk of values, morality. I think this partly comes from traditional Marxism itself in terms of its emphasis on a certain kind of materialism which is unable to accommodate these factors, which are themselves real, but in a different sense. There is a certain kind of a relative autonomy to this kind of a social imaginary, this kind of an abstract imaginary, which might be not strictly material in that hard sense that you can touch, in the tangible sense that Marx spoke about materialism. I think therefore it has, over a period of strength, in fact in my book on India after Modi, I say that right has become rightists have become dialectical materialists and left has become mechanical idealists. That we begin to know we are not attuned to these new changes, that we are becoming more and more idealists in terms of sticking to those classical positions. But I see right being quite dialectical. In fact, the only Gramscians I see in Indian context is the Indian right, that they can overcome confidence, they can look in terms of continuity, they can think quite dialectical. Of course, I refer to it as performative dialectics, that they do not push them to resolve those contradictions, but at performative level, at the level of optics, they're able to produce a certain kind of dialectic quality. So I think that my third proposition would be, I think we need to really seriously rethink in terms of culture, loosen up ourselves a little from this hangover of materialism that has been hanging on our heads like a Damocles sword for quite some time, that we have to prove ourselves as being materialists. And therefore, this overemphasis on scientificity, productivism, which I think modernity does not exhaust. Cultural sociologists have written quite well on this. It does not exhaust this place for myths and meaning in lifetime. If you look at the recent pandemic, Rajiv would know that our Prime Minister, before in terms of health facilities, but we did quite well in terms of optics of it. That's where the Prime Minister asked people to come and to the balconies and light diyas and go for clapping. Many people mocked at it, but I would say that these are very important gestures in terms of solidarity, in terms of giving ability to make sense, make meaning of our own situation. I think right somehow in terms of their proximity to cultural codes is able to make sense of the place that these processes need to be put in place. While left, partly because in the leadership of left over a period of time came from educated middle class, that project of left politics have somehow collapsed in project of modernization. And therefore, it's difficulty in dealing with questions of tradition, questions of culture, community, emotions, and so on and so forth. My fourth point would be in terms of this entire the structural analysis.
Can you please elaborate your?
Sorry, I think we'll come to that. Let me complete and then somebody has questions. We can take it up in course of our discussion. But anyway, it's up to Aasim to answer, not me. So I'm putting all the trouble for Aasim to take care of. This is the solidarity aspect. I also have only question. Aasim will have to answer, not me. So my fourth point, I think, would really be in terms of observe with the Indian left and even the radical left forces is that when they attempt structural analysis, what they call the structural analysis, the scientific analysis, by default it seems to eliminate the methodology. That most of subject positions seem to fall out of our net of who constitutes that revolutionary progressive subject. Outside our while structural analysis gives us a broad frame, but maybe in terms of everyday ethics, we need to look at a different place and to look at this kind of populism, the way it works. I think it's more attuned to social differentiation much better than what left does. Left structural analysis was supposed to account for somehow that point seems to be not coming across. And that also I think came, I'll come to you the point, the specific points that you made in the course of your own. My final point in terms of this broad background would be that it's also in terms of strategy of left politics, that it's often, as I said, from the structural analysis, a very unified kind of a common, universal, generalized strategy is what left always adopts. But if you look at the southern regions, I think the regions hold, I think we have such regional diversity. When Pakistan has such 3 or 4 major regions, Balochistan and other regions, that way regional histories are quite different. And therefore we need, I think, very many different strategies. And often this is, in left, it's an anathema to suggest to them that they need to have different strategies or they need the strategy. It's often considered to be impure and contaminated. I often remember when I attend my left friends, observe their, functions when they celebrate, when they are no more. One of the compliments they often get is that the position he took in 1950 was the position he took in 2000. He stuck to his position. Our sense of commitment on the left is some sort of unwavering, unchanging position. But I think in the South Asian context, we need to be completely open to change. Of course, we need, without it degenerating dramatism. But how do we then have this regional variation? Especially, I know you have played an important role in Pakistan in bringing all left parties together. That this idea of a unified left, a single party left, how does it then accommodate strategies that might actually fly in very different directions because of the regional diversity? Because land holdings are different, urbanization is different, middle class is different, rates of literacy are different. You take on any of these parameters, India almost every 100, 200 kilometers has a complete different demography, different cultural practices, and left goes ahead with the same strategy, all over India they have the same strategy. The strategy might have been born in Bengal, but then that is stretched, like the European theory is born in Europe, England is pushed all over the world. Left does something similar in terms of internal colonization. And therefore, we need to, I think, move in terms of how do we accommodate these regional diversities? How do we have different strategies which might look, conflicting, which might look like wavering, which might look like we are confused. Right does it obviously through opportunism by speaking at cross purposes. Right does it in a very different way. For instance, in India, the BJP is fighting against cow slaughter in North India, but the BJP candidate in Kerala offers good quality beef if he wins the election. So right accommodates diversity through completely different strategy, which we cannot. So the left needs to really reinvent in terms of how does it accommodate this differentiation. And there I feel that this prototype of French Revolution being the prototype for left all over the world is not something that we need to really rethink. Should that really be the ideal imagination of revolution and radical change? We might have to imagine him, as Gramsci talks, in terms of molecular change. It could be in very different ways. We can talk about it at some other occasion. But this is my whole broad question. Coming quickly to the specifics of the, you're asking a very important questions that in some sense we have been discussing in India is this whole question of digital life world you talked about. It really throws a challenge, even the very nature of urbanization, post neoliberalism in India. I think throws completely different kinds of challenges. But on that specific note, what I seem to observe in Indian context is that there is no intergenerational shift that's happening in the Indian in terms of leadership, in terms of demographic composition, in terms of social composition. Therefore, you see that the leadership is still fixed with a certain age group. That the new are not simply, I think that has something to do with your point on the new digital life world and left certain kind of a discomfort that left. I think this discomfort has also to do with a new kind of an aspirational subject that has emerged on the ground. Left project of modernization could, in a very insidious way, have a certain sense of patronage, this whole vanguard model that we have, which today it rebels against the very sensibilities of the modern subject. That is a post-patron client kind of a subject that has emerged, which is aspirational, which wants to. So I think this aspirational subject, I feel there is some tension with the way left imagines subject for and this digital social media adds that, the way people and that also takes me to the expansion of middle class, that how left deal with the expansion of middle class that's happening in South Asian countries. And I think Pakistan and India, in that sense, are undergoing this transition at a simultaneous time with new urbanization, with the new middle class expanding. We might have to think in fresh terms, not through conventional categories of class, while class analysis and capital labor analysis remains extremely important, but the imprint of capital we could find it through very many different social processes. For instance, notion of loneliness, problems of boredom, monotony, some kind of nihilism that the young are grappling with, should not ideally be outside the purview of left politics. And these are, I think, issues that one can read capital itself, that capital is leaving its imprint through these kinds of modern social processes that Europe witnessed, but I think India and Pakistan are not far behind. Some of these what can you call cultural, psychological processes, I think left can do much better by linking them to capital and political, more structural kind of process. Then the process of social fragmentation that you referred to, that I think Rajiv also referred to in his introductory remarks in terms of caste, tribal groups, migrant labor, what do we do? Is again, I think this is a new question that we'll have to. Is social fragmentation should one read it merely as fragmentation, or should one read this as social differentiation? And I think all modern societies, as Weber would call them, I think social differentiation is here to stay. There's no way we can go back to pre-modern societies where societies were unified and relatively less complex. I think social differentiation is something that is here to stay, and that's what is generating new kinds of complexities. I think that's where I think we need to rethink this whole business of universal subjects that Aasim was talking about. That we need a more concrete imagination of solidarity. We need a more concrete imagination of fraternity. Lachlan Move offered us this kind of a loose rainbow coalition kind of a model, but we need to move beyond because we'll have somewhere factor in that social differentiation is here to stay. We're not going to go back to any simplified society where cultural, social, other kinds of distinctions are going to, I think modernity is only going to unleash more differentiation. And the left project, without contradicting or collapsing or relating or congealing this differentiation, has to generate shared thoughts and shared kind of points. So I'll have more points, but I'll stop here and forward to Aasim's reaction, and then maybe we can open it up.
Thank you, Mr. Aasim.
Yeah, I mean, there's just more questions that have been, for instance, this question of let's say state ideology around national security, which is India historically speaking. But either way, democracy is the sort of popular imagination of what politics is, and certainly there cannot be a sort of a very simplistic, oh, democracy is just bourgeois democracy, or democracy is always contaminated because it is ultimately sort of dictated by the logics of capital. I think at an analytical level that critique is important, certainly, and continues to be important. But in terms of the popular imaginary of the people, so to speak, however they may be differentiated, I think it is something the left has to grapple with, and historically has not, right? So, that you can. I mean, having said that, mind you, I would say that the Indian left, the parliamentary left, has still done so better, right? It won elections over a number of decades in at least 2 states, So, although that has something to do with the fact that in Pakistan, of course, the left has been completely criminalized, and parliamentary constitution would never have been countenanced. But in any case, I share this feeling that this instinct to say that simply dismissing democracy is not, I think, useful in any sense. Just like, again, a lot of these points link and relate to one another. Just like this question of aspiration, I fully agree. I think that what I observe is that we tend towards the extremities on the left, right? So we look, and that makes sense, right? Because you speak for those who are the most brutalized. You speak for the peripheries. You speak for Kashmir or Assam or the northeastern states in India. It could be Balochistan or the war-torn parts of the Pashtun regions in Pakistan's case. But they are not the majority, as Ajay was pointing out. What do you do about the vast majority of people who have aspirations, who think of democracy as a form of mobility, who are coming into the cities, who are looking to find ways to climb up the social ladder. And, you know, broadly, if not middle class, I mean, I think, again, like I said, there could be just simply points of emphasis that would be different. I think that there's an aspiration to be middle class, and I think that is very much a hegemonic aspiration. And large numbers of young people seek to become part of the middle class if they aren't yet. You know, whether they're doing so through education or what have you, whatever the means and methods are. So I think, again, we have to speak to these do not have to be mutually inclusive sort of objectives or mutually exclusive constituencies. They are the most excluded, the most brutalized, you know, the various minorities, the wretched of the earth, so to speak, but there is a big in between, there's a big mass. Certainly, you know, the evidence, the data shows that through the last 30 years, there has been a tremendous amount of social mobility throughout South Asia. China, of course, is the prototypical case. You know, the hundreds of millions being lifted out of poverty. I mean, I have to admit, I think there's a bit of there's a fair amount of exaggeration there. But even if there is, there's also a fair amount of truth to it. And I think the question of inequality is important. I think in politics, perception of how much of a share you do get of this share of the pie, the proverbial pie. But in any case, to ignore it, to pretend it's not there, to pretend that, oh, everyone is either rich or very poor, you know, that's just not sufficient. It's not accurate. As I said, you know, I was talking about how we tend towards the politics of resistance. Well, resistance tends to be concentrated amongst segments that are the most brutalized, not amongst the median segment, which is not doing great, fine, but definitely not characterizing itself as heavily brutalized. Therefore, we have to be able to speak to that. We have to speak to democracy. I think the point about culture and values and meaning, again, absolutely, certainly, something that we've struggled to do because of an emphasis on sort of the specifically material aspects of social life and deprivation, as opposed to the right wing. Which, by the way, I don't think speaks to culture. I think the right wing, at least the contemporary right, the religious right in Pakistan, they bring both of these things together, right? They are able to attract the excluded segments, the poor, but they are able to speak in the language of values and meaning. And it could be values in this world or the hereafter. But the point is that they speak of things. That is, you know, certainly not a realm that we can pretend doesn't exist. So, I mean, in many sense, I share a lot of this. You know, I think that there can be agreements and disagreements about how and where our strategies conform or are similar or different. Like, can we look at democracy in its current form as something that we can deepen? Yes. How much can we deepen it? I think these are matters of debate. I agree about questions, and then the question of the universal, same thing. I think that's precisely what I was pointing to. You can't possibly now go back to a world in which we can propagate one subject as the revolutionary subject. You know, I just don't think that is a world that we are going to retrieve. Having said that, I do think that, you know, a left project, and I think this is where that conceptual tension between a war of position, war of maneuver becomes important for us. I think that there is an argument I would posit, and it's an argument, it's a hypothetical argument rather than something that I'm actually, again, I'm thinking aloud. Which at least in for the future beyond. Democracy actually get some of the stuff that those higher up the social ladder are getting. And that does definitely speak to this need to speak about meaning and value and what else there is in life. And I think that is what the right, I agree, does. They do both well. And of course, as was pointed out, instrumentally, as a form of performance, certainly. But that's not new. That's not something to sort of lament. Because that's why we speak of right and left, because ostensibly we think that the left project is about something more substantive. And if it is about something more, if it is about social transformation, then it has to be able to speak to individual experience as well. I think partly it's to recover some of the classic philosophical insights, right? It was about ultimately individual freedom. This I think it's a fine read to say there is no individual freedom in Marx, for instance. And that's what the neoliberals did. The neoliberal project was all about freedom and centering and propagating this idea that, well, compared to all these bureaucratic, collectivist monsters, we are the ones who have this individual freedom. So certainly, I mean, I think for the most part, I share a lot of what was said, a lot of what Ajay pointed out, and I agree with it. I think that what we can, I think the points of difference or disagreement would be in the details, into the details. So what does engaging with democracy look like? How in Pakistan, engaging with democracy is like, is inextricable from the question of the dominance of the military historically and in the contemporary period. And how do I do it? I don't think it's mutually exclusive. I don't think it means that, oh, therefore I just write it off. But how do I do it? And I think when differences across countries, and as was pointed out, even within individual countries come to the fore. Certainly, I think that in thinking about all of these questions, these are all not just valid, but essential questions that have to be engaged with. And I'll say again at the end that I think that, which is where I ended off and where I came back to starting to respond to what Ajay had said, that we cannot speak only to the margins, to the acute basis of resistance. That's our natural propensity to go to the ultimate, to like the absolutely wretched of the earth. And that is what makes the left. And I think there's no that's what, of course, the revolutionary imaginary is about the wretched of the earth. But yes, but in the 21st century, individual subjects don't think of themselves as revolutionaries. They want to climb up the social ladder, and whether they do it through democracy, whether they do it through some kind of middle-class aspiration, or a combination of all of these things, whether they seek, individual meaning, all of these things are underemphasized in the left's history. I agree. It's my experience as well. And I think that we have to be able to address these questions, and obviously part of what this sort of discussion and engagement does is allows us to do that. So I'll throw it back to you before a child completely disrupts our whole.
You at least have a revolutionary.
Okay. Professor Ajay, do you have any further comment?
No, I think, Rajesh, thanks for that. But I think we have broad agreement that I think concerns are very similar as Aasim said. We could discuss more on the details are different. The historical formation, social formation in India, Pakistan will be different as in other South Asian countries. So we can come back to those issues depending on, let's open it up. Let's hear from our young friends what they have to say.
Before I open up, I think if Professor Aasim Sajjad has something to question or anything to you, I think that would again, if anything, you have to Professor Vijay. Oh, sorry, because here the name is correctly Professor Ajay, sorry.
Yeah, no, I mean, if not,
I'm using.
the only question I would have, I mean, I don't think it's a question that has to be answered as such. I mean, I think it's more like, for me, when I think the left, I think less the formal, well, as much perhaps left party, more this broader, as I said, this broader demographic of young people that are involved in sort of digitally, or, like the anti-CAA protests. That for me is the emergent sort of demographic of people that I think are on the left. And I wonder, would you categorize them on the left, or for you, the left is literally just the formal party left?
So I think that, that's a key question, Aasim, that we need to imagine left in this kind of a much broader term. And I think the key challenge, tension for many of us would be this, that as you said, left propensity in terms of going to the most stretcher of the earth. That's what the much left does, which I think is what makes left the left, which unlike all other national parties on the right or social democrats, so on and so forth. But then from that vantage point, how do you include the new kind of objects that are emerging through urbanization, through aspirations, through mobility? I think that's where the left, I think, seems to be more exclusionary instead of excluding and imagining that to be containing. I think we need a lot more intellectual resources in terms of capturing complexity, which I think is way beyond the old left's kind of imagination of starting with a single subject and proliferating. I think so. I think we have similar concerns in terms of this really needs new types of categories altogether, and that's I think that's where I think the kind of initiative that Rajiv took should be useful, and we hope China would also join in this new effort.
Okay, so I think we should open the floor, and we have Aasim Sodhar. He is former student of Professor Aasim Sajjad. So he would like to ask a question. Aasim?
Yes, can you hear me?
Your voice is very low.
Hello?
I think you should come closer to your laptop or computer and then you speak a little louder.
I'm very close to my. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear.
Just be as loud as you can.
Okay. So first of all, I'm very thankful to you, Dr. Rajiv, and the Center for South Asian Studies, Yangon University, for arranging such a wonderful talk. Actually, I want to ask two questions to Dr. Aasim Sajjad, and these are very simple questions. The first question is, do you think that is there any possibility to make an alliance between the left forces of South Asia? So that was my first question. And the second question is that how can the left and politics of resistance be revived under current situation when the populist forces are dominating in our region, especially when we are talking about South Asia? So these were two questions from my side. Thank you.
Thanks. Look, I think that, of course, in principle, the left force. Well, first we'd have to, what both I think me and Ajay were both trying to sort through is who is the left? Right? Like when we say, can they, should they come together, should they ally? I think to an extent that happens, partly now in not in said ways, in more like sort of by just by chance ways in online spaces. I think, of course, you always run risk nowadays. I mean, it doesn't take very much. You don't have to be very far on the left to be branded anti-state in either country. So if you started reaching out to one another in highly public ways, then God help us all. But certainly, of course, I mean, look, internationalism is a big part of the left's legacies. I mean, I think what we're discussing here is not that any of these legacies are the principles that the left has always stood for are timeless principles. They're universal principles that, including solidarity across space, across the nation-state boundaries, and in South Asia particularly so. Right? Like how can I mean, us in Pakistan, we know the significance of India as sort of this symbol, this figurehead that has always served sort of the purposes of reinforcing state ideology, and I think vice versa. So I think, you know,
To mute, I think I'm just searching where the noise is coming from.
It's coming from someone's name that is Nayab Rizvi.
Nayab Rizvi.
There you go. So yeah, so very briefly, yeah, they're just, yes, certainly. But, you know, and I think that that's always happened, and I think it can happen more. And I would argue that actually even beyond formally left forces, I think like this speaks to the second question: how can we revive this politics? Well, I think what we're both agreeing on is that sort of the politics of the right is hegemonic because it speaks to the majority, and the left generally is not able to reach that majority. And that underlies all of these desires. Can we speak to each other across the boundaries of the nation state? Yes, but the more of us that do it, the better. You know, the more popular and widespread that conversation is, the better. Of course, probably progressives or left forces are the ones who are inevitably going to spearhead that process. But the wider the reach of the left, and that's, you said, can the politics of resistance be revived? Actually, I think it's the other. I think probably insofar if we start from the assumption that resistance tends to be located on the margins, at least in the contemporary period, and sort of majoritarian, not majority of the population. Is involved in the mundane, banal, everyday forms of politics that in some ways the right is able to succeed in, then that is actually our challenge. The challenge is to penetrate those banal, everyday spaces and to generate a competing narrative of politics within those spaces. You know, my experience of being on the left is that people say these people are really good and they're principled and they stand up for the right causes, but they're never going to win an election. You know, because the politics of running for an election is conceived of differently. We sort of the popular imaginary is that people on the left don't really do elections well, or just don't do elections. So in a sense, that's our challenge. Does that mean, you know, again, this is the quandary, this is the difficulty. Does that mean we shift tack and completely stop speaking for the proverbial region of the earth? No, but you know, as I said earlier, that's the challenge of being on the left. That you have to take on both of those tasks. Otherwise we'll always do what is the necessary part of the equation, which is to stand with the wretch of the earth without quite managing the sufficient condition to be a mainstream force, which is to reach out to those in the middle, to those seeking integration, to those with aspiration, to those who are not immediately drawn to sort of the ideology that we speak of, and I think that's the challenge. Again, I would say that Pakistan is, you know, we're on a spectrum. I think historically, Pakistan has been the least amenable country in South Asia for the left for any number of, partly because of its Cold War positioning, perhaps the way in which you know, the binary that has generally been partly on the left too, to be fair, been created between a religious society and then what the left ostensibly stands for. But you know, India's catching up real quick. You know, like the rest of South Asia is doing, you know, trying to converge with the Pakistani trajectory of militarism and exclusion and majoritarianism as quickly as it possibly can. So the objective conditions are clear, and I think that that's what we have to do, is to sort of step into that majoritarian space, be able to speak to it rather than constantly just be on the other side of it.
I'm
There is Asad Baloch. He wants to ask a question. Asad Baloch, you can ask. Unmute yourself. Okay.
Okay. Are you hearing me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. My basic questions from Dr. Aasim Sajjad about the Marxists. When we are looking to the Pakistan, what are the contribution of the Marxism in Pakistan? Overall, I can say the majority of the peoples are not the well educated. How we say them what is the Marxism, because they are unaware. So how I don't think Marxist or Marxism will be in Pakistan.
Yeah, look, I agree with you in the sense of, I think that if you look at India, if you look at Sri Lanka, I think that there's look, I think that the mainstreaming or the fact that India, for instance, has a communist party, or India that is in the mainstream, two, not just one, but two, historically one, that became two, that has run for elections, that has been in power in a couple of states, and even in the academy, that there is Marxism, at least historically. I won't speak for the contemporary period necessarily, but historically, is a sort of a field of intellectual discourse that is known, perhaps how widely or not is one thing. I think Pakistan is sort of the space for Marxism as a field of intellectual inquiry has been much less historically. I mean, like individual Pakistani Marxists who've been known the world over, like for instance, like Hamza Alvi, was barely known within Pakistan itself. Like a handful of people, or a particular segment, of the political would know of him. But if you talked about the academy, because of course Marxism is a field of intellectual academic inquiry, irrespective of whether we're talking about left politics as such. So in that sense, I agree with you. I don't think that's because Marxism had nothing to say to Pakistan, or nothing useful to say about Pakistan or its society or its state. I think a lot of useful and important contributions were made. But I think the political climate was always less conducive in Pakistan for Marxism to flourish in any way. So that's not to suggest, mind you, and I think that we've already talked, both me and Ajay have talked about some of the blind spots of Marxist analysis, some of its sort of insufficiencies, whether it be in the past or the present. Some of it's sort of being stuck. This idea I share with Ajay about, it's one thing to have a political commitment. It's another thing to say, well, I'm saying the same thing now as I was saying 50 years ago. That's not necessarily a marker of political commitment. That might more be a marker of dogmatism, right? Because my commitment really should be to a particular principle or cause. And that, therefore, in principle, if society changes, it must be that I articulate that differently than I did 50 years ago. Otherwise, there's some fundamental disjunct there. So that's not to suggest that that's also not something that has to be flagged. But I think that, again, I won't speak for anywhere else in Pakistan. I think when you have a oppressive political climate, that actually reifies certain ideas as well, right? It means that they don't grow as well as they might have if there was more openness. That's not to say that everything would have been hunky-dory and Pakistani Marxism would be, at the top of the intellectual tree today if we weren't like a Cold War outpost or something. But nevertheless, I think that also is a factor, and I think that's an important even now, it's certainly an important factor. I think that applies now to every part of South Asia. If the intellectual climate is oppressive, then the space for debate is less, then the chances of intellectual growth are also truncated.
We have question from Paulo, who is from Uruguay, Latin America. He is a student at Shanghai University. I'm reading his question. Hi, Professor. Thanks for your dissertation. My question is, how much do the heritage of USSR and the American influence on the left politics in South Asia? And another query, he wants to know your book that you have mentioned during your talk, Professor Aasim.
I didn't mention the book. I think he might be talking to, might have been referring to Ajay, because I definitely didn't mention any book.
But he privately said to me that the question is for you. So maybe.
Okay. All right. Well, I didn't mention any book, so I'm not sure which one I might have referred to. But yeah, I mean, this actually just speaks to what I just mentioned about the influence of, basically Cold War politics on the left. So, Pakistan was unequivocally, for pretty much all of the Cold War, was on the very much on the American side of the Cold War, and that led to the criminalization of the left. Actually, the Communist Party was banned officially in the early 1950s. And then since then, really, it was always operating sort of in this underground sort of fashion, and was never able to articulate itself as an open political force. Of course, it had a significant amount of influence in the organized labor movement and the student movements. But in comparison, let's say, to next door India, where, as I said, there was, the communist parties were actually parliamentary participants in parliamentary politics and had some success in the process. So certainly that has a huge influence. On the other hand, it also has an influence on, as I've just said, perhaps reifying some teleological ideas. Ajay started off very early on, right at the beginning, talking about industrialization and democracy. And we still, to this day, it's 2020, there are still, some elements on the left, I agree, generally of a particular generation, who still say, well, we have yet to reach the stage of industrialization, and we will, and then an industrial proletariat will emerge, and then, socialism will follow. And I think anyone on the left in South Asia is familiar with this sort of debate, sadly, still existing. And so, that's the other side of this, that came from in some ways, essentially just uncritical adherence to ideas emanating from different contexts. That could be from the Soviet Union, could also have been, in the case of Pakistan, there was a fair amount of influence from the Chinese left. So there's definitely a legacy. And that is still with us. And I don't think all of it is to be frowned upon, especially in terms of the legacy of the 20th century socialist states. There's a lot of positive legacies too, but broadly speaking, in Pakistan's case, that was, it was more, as I said, the suppression or the sort of suffocation of space that was the primary legacy.
We have another Sapna. She wants to ask a question to Aasim. Sapna ji, you can unmute yourself and then. Hello.
Hello.
Yes. Go ahead.
Hello.
Yeah, we hear you. You can ask.
Thank you so much. Actually, my question is from Aasim Sahab. He talked about the digital space. So I just want to ask, as online activism is a major influential political organization as it is considered nowadays, my question is it really a replacement or an alternative as compared to other platforms how we can space, as he has talked about the digital space or some other spaces?
No, I mean it's not either a replacement or an alternative. It's just a new objective reality that I I simply feel it's important for us to think about. It's already there, it's happening, it's already exerting a significant influence on contemporary political life. I would say, in terms of formally, in terms of political power, acquiring power, it's definitely largely been of assistance to the right. The right is, as with most other things, been able to utilize this space very effectively, more so than the left. But either way, it's there. It's something for us to think about, to grapple with. It of course, there's also, the literature also tells us that there's a digital divide, as they call it. There's, on the one hand, it's increasingly important and increasingly influential, but there's also a significant section of society that remains unable to access it. My feeling personally is that with time, it will become more and more, more and more people will become part of this space, one way or the other, in one form or the other, passively or actively, either way. Often in terms of as a form of social interaction or culture. I don't know whether the same thing happened in India, but there was this huge big uproar in Pakistan recently about TikTok, the Chinese app, which was for about a few days was banned, and of course all hell broke loose because there's 20 million or 25 million TikTok users in Pakistan, and as I suspect is the case in many parts of the world, TikTok compared to things like Twitter, for instance, has a much more humble class background is associated with it, and so either way now, whether someone is formally articulating a political opinion on it or making a video, which is a satire of government, it is a form of political expression, and it is something that I think is going to be increasingly important. And also, I think a big part of the way that if you relate to something that Ajay said, that through which a large segment of society is being integrated into capitalism, via digital technology. You can be from a humble background, you could be from a village, but one of the first things you're going to do is get a smartphone with 3G connection, and that both links you to the world and also makes you, into a formal, in some way, into a consumer on the market, and in fact, really gives a fillip to that whole aspiration to further integrate yourself. And so, irrespective of whether we think that's good or bad or whatever, it is, it is a fact that we have to grapple with it and think about it, and to think about how it's going to affect and is already affecting politics. So it's not about a displacement or an alternative. It's about integrating that life world into our understanding of how politics is being shaped. That's what I was suggesting is important for us to do.
Thank you. I think we still have time, so we can take one or two.
There's someone here, Waqar Yunus, I see.
So we have Waqar Yunus wants to. Yeah, Waqar Yunus, ji.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Sir, my question is that, like India, Pakistan also have the bulk of its population from age group 18 to 30. And when I see the student politics in India and Pakistan, while comparing both of them, the University students protested very strongly on the issues. While in the pandemic situation in Pakistan, the students from Balochistan, Sindh, and South Punjab have issues of online classes and like many other issues. But they have not got any support from other parts of the country. Don't you think that the most, we can say, the educated class of Pakistan, if they don't stand united for their cause, how can you say that these people would go and educate the entire nation or the rest of the nation?
Yeah, I didn't quite catch much of that. Did you get some of that, Rajiv? You could just.
I think he's talking about the student politics, and then that you mentioned digital divide, that during this pandemic, like a lot of villagers or like village resident, they don't have access to the internet. So how they can continue their education? So I think basically he's asking about these two things.
Yeah, no, I mean, like I said, there is this divide. It is a class divide. It's also regional, of course, which maps sometimes onto class, but not exclusively on class. That's something else that Ajay was pointing out, which again speaks to something more historical as well, uneven development across different geographies within the nation state. So it's there. Yeah, I mean, look, these are all multiple scales and different levels of contradiction. And there's no gainsaying it. And of course, in situations like the pandemic, all of these contradictions came to the fore, right? Like, I would just say, even this whole question of the aspirational middle class, right? A lot of them were dramatically pushed back down the ladder that they had been tenuously climbing, right? When they're basically whatever forms of employment that they had were basically well, not they as a whole, but certain large segments, because the economy shut down and the capital's wheel stops moving, and that of course then has a massive multiplier effect across different classes. So these are all realities, and absolutely you're right. There these come to the fore, more often than not, in regions and amongst classes that are already from disadvantaged backgrounds, whether it's a lack of infrastructure, whatever it may be, especially the digital. I was simply pointing to the fact that irrespective of that, in some ways, just to link to what Ajay has been saying, irrespective of that doesn't necessarily change. In fact, if you think about the example of student politics in Pakistan, or students during the pandemic who were obviously bringing this to attention, like, well, we don't have access to classes, right? You're telling us to go online and take classes. We can't. What are they saying with that? What they're actually saying is that they want integration. They want to be part of the mainstream. They're not saying, oh, that means I'm going to completely turn my back on the mainstream. It's more a desire to be integrated. And this is an interesting tension, right? Because on the one hand, if these contradictions grow and if they don't get integrated, and I think that's part of perhaps a different debate at a different time. Can capitalism, can democracy actually deliver? That's actually one of the questions. I think that what's happened over the last 20, 25, 30 years, as Ajay pointed out, is that, whether it's through formal democratic sort of democracy, or because of globalization broadly, or probably a combination of those two things, that there has been a lot of upward mobility. Will that continue? Will now there be are we shifting to a phase where in fact now that's going to be held up, that's going to, the economic growth is going to stagnate, which there's certain suggestions that it may be doing. Then what kind of reactions? Even then, I suspect the right wing benefits from that, because they say, well, frustrated aspirations are then taken out on some mythical other that you could demonize. One way or the other, we have to grapple with this, right? Either way, we have to be able to think about these questions, look at the fact that people aspire, young people like the ones that the Vakar was just asking or bringing to our attention, aspire to be integrated, and then devise strategies, whether it's via addressing their material concerns, or whether, I fully agree, whether it's speaking to their larger questions of meaning in life and values and aspects of alienation that they may be suffering because they're not integrated in the ways that they seek, or because the system does not have that capacity. It promises them. It's like the American dream, right? Everybody can make it, but everybody doesn't make it, and inequality does grow. And then how do you address that? Do you address that by simply speaking to material deprivation, or do you also speak to, as Ajay was pointing out, other aspects of life and the alienation that is generated because of these inequalities? So either way, these are important central questions, and and I think this is how we take a step closer to at least identifying them when we talk about them, irrespective of a very long process of being able to do something about them.
I think we can take one last question from The name is Bloch. I think only surname is coming. So, Mr. Bloch.
Yes, I'm audible to you.
Yes, yes. Go ahead.
So I have a question from Mr. Aasim Sajjad. Is hearing?
I think your voice is cracking and some internet problem, I guess. So you can write.
Are you hearing me? I repeat.
Yes. Okay. Go ahead.
Are you? Okay, sir. I'm sorry for this disruption, sir. Thank you very much for providing us this platform, Mr. Rajan, and rest of all. And I have a question from Mr. Aasim. Sir, during the days when Nawab Harbaksh Baloch was holding the Baloch left politics, like he was influenced by the government under USSR. At that time, it was understandable. But considering Pakistan's politics, I don't find any hope that any sort of such ideology could help a nation like Baloch, which are divided by British in 3 states, and the rest of all deviating based on language, tribe, and way of life, are created by the establishment of Pakistan to paralyze a whole nation, which is as old as the Yellow River civilization. So, do you think there is any hope that such ideologies could help a nation like Baloch? Simple.
If ever it was $1 million question, that would be it. I mean, what first, just to sort of respond to what you say. Look, I mean, across South Asia, we have nations, with long, proud histories that are part of these small nation states that, of course, have never been felt fully integrated and felt like they are, they basically are second-class citizens. This is what we were talking about, the peripheries, both in India and Pakistan, and in Nepal and Sri Lanka, everywhere. And this is a big part of our shared history of this region, that we do, that there are, nations like the Baloch, or ethnic nations like the Baloch, that have long-standing grievances with the nation state. Do I think that there are potential, that there is a possibility for let's say broadly a politics of the left that can speak to communities or ethnic nations like the Baloch? Sure, I do. I mean, I certainly do, as at a conceptual level or principally. Is that going to happen easily, or what are the contours of that? I think it's quite complex. I think you noted very briefly that under Cold War conditions, many such movements had an affinity to let's say the Soviet Union, or in terms of the Cold War divide. That doesn't really exist now. The world in which we live is not really divided in that way, where you find movements like that find support, in terms of the global political economy. So really, then, the challenge is to people in the Pakistani mainstream to be able to reach out to and speak to the needs and demands of ethnic groups like the Baloch. Has that happened historically to an extent? Has it not happened? Yes, also not happened. I think Ajay mentioned, if you look at the Indian left, there's still like this, the leaderships in terms of their generation, in terms of their where they come from, in terms of parts of India, are still quite insular. And I think that's one of the reasons why, the project perhaps fails to get traction across these divides. And I think insofar as the Baloch youth still feel like that the left does not speak to them, I think that's something that the left has to be able to respond to. Having said that, either way, I think the question goes back to even in the case of nationalist movements, which we haven't spoken about today. They also have to take stock. What kind of political allies do they have in countries and contexts like South Asia? And given the right and the rise of the right generally, perhaps all of these progressive forces, whether the people who call themselves left, whether those who call themselves nationalists, better suited to trying to develop linkages and building bridges. Of course, that's hard, and that will require an acknowledgement, especially in terms of peripheral regions like the Loch, that there are long-standing grievances that have to be addressed. There's no shortcut to that.
Thank you. I think before we end, I have one query. I think maybe as Professor Aasim has mentioned that the left should kind of move to a digital space to have a kind of a meaningful interaction and communication. Now,